Once where
with your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome to Heard Tell. This is one of our favorites. We haven't talked to her for a while, although I did get to see her in real life a while back. Grace, see her pause because she's waiting to see if I get her right. Bydalek.
Hey, you did it.
Hey, I did it. Grace Bydalek. She sings, she dances, she performs, she runs the Dissident Project. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. All around wonderkund of young voices. How are you, my friend?
Oh, I am hanging in. We talked about it a little bit, but Omaha, Nebraska, which is where I'm from, is dealing with that bomb cyclone that we were talking about. And so we're sort of on the tail end of that. And the temperature is slowly rising from negative 11 degrees yesterday to negative 7 degrees tomorrow. And we're hoping that at a certain point, we hit a bearable temperature to go outside again. So I've essentially been inside for the past 3 days, but otherwise I'm doing great. How are you?
Yeah, it's really interesting how weather works, because I went up to Chicago a couple of weeks ago and they're like, oh, this is like the best week of the whole winter. It was like, low to mid 40s, not Chicago standards, not bad at all. Then I go to Myrtle Beach earlier this past week and it's colder there than it was in Chicago, but then the weather changes. I was in Denver the end of October. It was 75 every day and now they're negative 20 today. Weather's weird. It's crazy in the wintertime. You're a New Yorker, though, now, transplanted, so you're used to wild weather changes and bad weather. Here's what you've been doing, though. I want to start with something good, because you're now the manager of the Dissident Project, and we've had a couple of them on. We just had Daniel on about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
I think this is one of the most important things we as young voices has done in a while, although, it kind of fell into our laps. You've done this for a while now.
Yeah.
How has it affected you and changed you, just working with these people, and not just the going into the schools and the organizations and that stuff? But we talked about it when you first did it, and the last time we had you on the show, is like, this is putting the human face on something that is just news stories to everybody else, or something in a book to everybody else. You do it every day. You talk to these folks every day, though. How has it affected you on that human level?
Yeah. Oof. Well, first of all, let me give you a little bit of context for the listeners who haven't heard about Dissident Project before. I know a lot of your listeners have, but I'm just going to give a little bit of backstory. So we are under the Young Voices umbrella, and we send dissident speakers from authoritarian and socialist countries around the world into American high schools to talk about the dangers of socialism and of authoritarianism. And this is really the of Daniel DiMartino, who, of course, you had on a couple weeks ago, who is now a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and is a PhD candidate at Columbia, and is really focused on promoting the principles of a free market society and talking about how that freedom benefits not only entrepreneurs, but everybody else. I think the difference between Dissident Project and other organizations is that these personal stories are so incredibly emotionally affecting, as you were pointing out, Andrew. I remember the first time that I heard personally a lot of these dissident stories, and we were sitting in a conference room at the Fund for American Studies in DC at our first annual speaker training, and I had come onto the project, I don't know, like 3 weeks before or something. So I hadn't been on the project long at all, and the recruits that we had were friends of Daniel, and were people who were connected to the organization through ways that I wasn't really familiar with. And the first time that I got to hear their stories was when they were really like working at the kinks in their different speeches. And I remember sitting and hearing about Daniel and his mom, who is an incredible baker, having to smuggle chocolate for bonbons that she wanted to sell in Venezuela, or Grace Joe's relatives dying of hunger, Grace holding her mom's dying baby, trying her best to keep it alive in dire conditions in North Korea. I heard about Francis's experience as a young protester in the umbrella movements in 2014. And, you know, I thought about my own sort of high school experience, which is when a lot of these speakers went through these incredible trials in their lives. And I thought to myself, you know, I had a Volvo. I drove to school about 3 blocks away from my house. I was gifted with an incredible education. My dad and my mom said, you know, we see that you're gifted and you're smart, and pick out a school and do what you want with your life, and we will help you get there, right? Like, we will support you in getting there. And I have known and felt the responsibility of being so blessed in my life, and of being supported unconditionally by those that I love, and of living in a country where I am able to pursue the things that I love without any real barriers in my way. And in that moment, you know, all of that really responsibility and all of that like human sort of crashes down, for lack of a better way to put it, like really crashes down on your shoulders. And you're like, these people are incredible. And the United States of America is incredible. And what we have as Americans is incredible. And we have to do everything in our power to make sure that we don't lose it.
Yeah, Grace. Bydalek joining us. You know, just to take you as the example, like, you know, you're basically a Hallmark movie, right? You're a Midwest girl, went to Michigan, became an actor, moved to New York, made it big, did all this stuff, been in, you know, shows and movies and all this stuff. You know, we just, you know, that's a Hallmark movie.
Yeah.
I think about my life, you know, 2-parent household. We weren't rich, but we were never missing anything. My parents were school teachers. My dad was very frugal with his money, so he had it for things we wanted to do. Got to travel a lot. Got to do the military. I've been around the world. Now I get to do this.
Yeah.
We're so blessed. But then when you talk to, I remember when I had you and Francis on, and she's talking about like, well, I'm talking to kids that when I was their age, I was in the street getting tear gassed with an umbrella, which is just something we saw on the news. She was there. That was their life. I don't know of any other way, because it's almost a cliche about, you know, well, Americans and ugly Americans when they go abroad and they're ignorant and all that. There's a little truth to that. And as I've traveled the world and as I've gotten my, I don't know a better way to do it than to just have people who have been there and now they're here
Yeah.
try to explain it to them, because I think we're media desensitized now. I don't, even when you see something shocking, it still has a shorter shelf life than it probably should. Has like the Hong Kong stuff, like the Venezuelans fleeing I just had Daniel on 7 million people out of that country. It's just gobsmacked, you know, 40% of the population left. Like, it's just, it blows your mind.
Yep.
I don't know of a better way to do it than to have those personal stories. And obviously they can't all sit down like they have with you and me privately and talk to us. But going into the schools, talk about that part of it is, and I asked Frances this, and she's like, yeah, it's just amazing to watch them. That reaction to that age group of, oh, this is somebody that was in my shoes and I could be in their shoes.
Yep.
That's really the formula for something like this, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, young people relate to young people, right? Like, you could have a dissident from Cuba who's 80 years old come in and talk about his experience, but and that can be valuable. That can be a really wonderful thing, but there's still sort of that barrier, that separation between, you know, that experience and the experience of an American high schooler today. And so to see, you know, young people connect with young people, not only through, you know, personal one-on-one experience, but also through social media, right? Like, a lot of our dissidents are incredibly active on social media. And Frances, actually, we're talking as we talk about sort of, you know, Hong Kong and the protests there, is fighting actively against the forces of TikTok, you know, in our country, and is relating to these students on a level that may actually be incredibly shocking to them. You know, how the Chinese government is using TikTok to influence hearts and minds in the United States in a way that's more insidious than we could ever really understand. And so, yeah, it's more relatable. It's more relatable.
Grace Bydalek joining us. You're a performer. You're an actress. You sing. You perform. Politics is performative now. It always has been, but especially now in the mass media and the internet age, it really is. Just put your performer hat on for a second, because I understand that you have to present, whether you're, a school teacher or just somebody talking or a preacher in a church or a politician at a podium. There's a performative aspect to stuff, especially when now everything needs to be online.
Yeah.
How do you view that stuff, though? Because there's so much of what our politics and culture stuff is just performative now. Does your radar go up immediately, like oh, they're really performing here? And then do you kind of see the craft to that when you look at it? Because you're trained to do that. You went to school for that. You've practiced it. Does your radar jump on that a little bit more than maybe our common mind is like, oh, this person's really performing, or oh, this person's so good I'm not noticing the performance, which is the mark of a real performer, right? Just talk about that for a second, because you see that through that's your profession in a lot of ways. How's that hit you when you look at things like politics and culture and how it's covered?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's an extent to which it's really important that politicians be trained in that way. It's really important for effective delivery that politicians be trained in that way, that pastors be trained in that way, that people who are trying to sort of influence the public sphere be trained in certain aspects of performance. However, I think that when performance becomes the end and not the means to the end, it gets a little bit convoluted, right? Like we see AOC sort of building a media platform, and like, what is she doing in DC? We're not exactly sure. So it I don't know. It sits sort of the wrong way with me. And I think that, like I said, as a politician can be incredibly effective through performance, but there's nothing more impactful than a one-on-one conversation with people. There's nothing more impactful than somebody who has been through, and when we go back to the Dissident Project, like there's nothing more impactful than somebody who has been through something firsthand and is telling you earnestly about that experience, who is relating to you on a level that you can understand. And so, yeah, I think my radar really goes up when I see certain levels of performance in politics nowadays.
Yeah, Grace Bydalek, which goes to the old acting thing of like the best performances are when you put something of yourself in it. Same with a singer, same with anything else.
Yeah.
How do we gauge that better? I'm just talking about the normal person. Like when we're looking at it, it's like, how do we gauge that? Because there's so much fake out there. Now, there's two ways to do that. One is the real really burns through in a hurry. When something real shows up, it makes everything look bad. But it's hard to discern that. How does somebody who's not trained to look at performance, though, how do we look for the real in the media? Just when we're watching a politician give a speech, or even something big like the Zelensky speech, where you have all the government there. That's performative. He's really good at that. He's winning a propaganda war. That's not a criticism. That's what he should be doing for his country, right? But you have all our politicians now changing because they're being seen in that group, or like a State of the Union, same thing. What's something we can look for trying to discern the real out of the noise and the mess of the media of the performance part of it, Mrs. Performer?
Oh man, well, that's a great question. It takes me back to my, collegiate days at the University of Michigan, majoring in musical theater, thinking about, discerning when you're dissecting a song or you're analyzing a script for the first time, reading the material and discerning what your in is, right? So how is it that I personally relate to this material, and what sort of emotional well, if we're really getting into sort of the actor terminology now, what sort of emotional well can I be pulling from here? What experiences have I had that that enabled me to relate to this character that I am trying to emulate, trying to embody, and what's my in? And then secondarily, like what is my objective as this character, as I'm stepping into these shoes? What is this character trying to accomplish? I think that to a certain extent, politicians are all playing characters, right? They're all playing characters who have objectives that they're trying to reach. I think when we can contextualize people and understand where it is they're coming from, understand their own personal experiences, and see what their quote unquote emotional in is to the topic at hand, what their quote unquote emotional in is to the speech that they're currently giving, to the policy that they're pushing. Like, you know, we can understand where it is their motivations are coming from. Now, whether or not somebody is emotional about something or is emotionally connected to something does not make it good policy. I think that we can, obviously separate empathy and, emotionality from policy that is beneficial to people, specifically in the United States. And that's something that, we're not necessarily adept at doing anymore. I think a lot of people govern out of the desire to be quote unquote empathetic, which actually in a lot of circumstances leads to the least empathetic policy for the most people. And we can look at that, in issues of immigration specifically right now.
Yeah, Grace Bydalek joining us. See, this is where we get back to the Dissident Project stuff
Yeah.
because they talk about how tyranny started in their country, especially somewhere like Venezuela, which that's been within my adult lifetime. So I've seen that happen in real time. China's been a little bit of a longer run, although the Xi Jinping era of the last, decade and a half or so, you can kind of parse that down a little bit. Every single one of the dissidents starts talking about the policy side went sideways when the policy started overriding the humanity, and it started overriding the people and what's best for folks. It always starts with that humanity part that you just talked about, humanizing folks, and policy that gets away from the humanity. There's no way to disentangle that when you lose your humanity. That's the slippery slope that always winds up in the really ugly place of war crimes and human terror and things like we see with the Uyghurs, or things like we see in Venezuela, or things like we see not just the southern border, which is a smaller part of a wider immigration crisis, but you see what refugees and displaced peoples have to go through, whether it's here in Europe or what we're seeing out of Ukraine trying to flee a war zone, or the Middle East or whatever. That's the thing you've always got to get to, because if you separate policy from humans, that's when you wind up with what happened in China, where we'll never know how many millions of people died, what happened in the Holocaust and how many millions died, the Holocaust, how many millions died.
But
that's the part of it.
But I also think it's important, when you're looking at what people are pushing under the guise of empathy, to be super discerning about whether or not the policy they're trying to push through is empathetic or not. I think we saw that a lot in COVID. Policy that was pushed under the name of, health and empathy toward this, the most amount of people, which was actually really detrimental for, the working class, for young people, for children. I think we're seeing that, with Democrats at the southern border. I think that we see that, even in sort of wokeness today, the idea that like Stanford is banning certain words from their lexicon, or is recommending that you not use certain words, diminishing the English language, under the guise of empathy. And so I think even just the word empathy can be incredibly convoluted and can be used to pass policy which is incredibly insidious. And so we have to be really discerning as conservative people and as people who try to be genuinely empathetic. What is empathy and what does it really mean? And like, is policy that is born out of a desire to be empathetic actually empathetic? I think it's a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, and you know what I do when I try to discern that? Because look, that's what we started this whole program on, was trying to discern things, try to figure out what's actually happened, not just chase and not just react to things. You know where I try to discern it when it comes to like something like that? Anytime somebody starts pushing a one size fits all, you just kind of mentioned it with the COVID thing. It's like, oh, well, this is for the greatest amount of people, so that's why we need to do it.
Yep.
That's the warning flag on that for me usually, is like, oh, well, this is going to make it better for everybody. Well, nothing in the history of ever has ever made everything better for everybody. That's not possible.
And that's why federalism is such an amazing system, right? Yeah, no, I completely agree.
The one size fits all thing is as much a red flag as oh, the people don't matter, the government matters more. That's a red flag too. We got to be able to walk and chew gum with this stuff, because there is a spectrum in the middle of good, bad, indifferent, and neutral, and whatever. But both of those are bad. And the problem is they can run parallel beside each other, and you don't know which side you're on sometimes. So discernment's a big thing. That's why I bring up the performative thing, even as a performing artist. There's skill sets to that we need to understand as people. Grace Bydalek, I love talking about stuff like this. Okay, got to talk a little politics with you, though. You were writing in the New York Daily News. That's a good get, by the way.
Thank you.
A couple of weeks ago, back at the beginning of December, you wrote about this. Now, you're the nicest person in the world. We just talked about empathy. You wouldn't hurt a mouse. But boy, you got some flack for this one. And all you wrote about was that it was too early to be endorsing Donald Trump.
Yeah.
I'll let you explain the piece in full, but boy, howdy, did that upset some folks.
Yeah, and that's okay. The piece was essentially a dissection of sort of an overview dissection of conservatism, of the conservative parties or of the conservative party and of the leadership that we are elevating, specifically as young conservatives. And, like you said earlier, I'm a New Yorker. I live in New York City. One of my life is to really, work for the flourishing of the city that I feel like God has called me to. And I look at the representatives that we have elevated specifically in young conservatism, and I wonder, aloud, if that representation is warranted, or is representation that we all as young conservatives can get behind. I really don't think that it is, specifically with the New York Young Republican Club. And so my piece was sort of equating an endorsement for Trump to an endorsement for the leadership of the New York Young Republican Club, which I think is it is high time that we reevaluate who we're elevating.
Yeah, and what was funny about the backlash of this is, like, all you're saying is this isn't a logical political decision as far as trying to advance the ball. It's all based on personality or business model or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
And then the backlash was all is you're disloyal. And then they took a run at some of our friends like Daniel. They're going to deport Daniel, and they're going to deport Gary and Frankel, our buddy, who, by the way, is a Chicano Texan. They were Americans long before we were, by the way, because they've been here since, Texas became a state. Then they took a run at, Stephen Kent, who hadn't even been there for 2 years. Then they took a run at me. You're proving her point when you go to the personal attacks and you're disloyal and you're not an American and all that. All you're doing is exactly proving the point that you started out with of, this is not good policy. It's not good politics. It's going to turn people off, and you're just making this exclusive in club that people aren't going to want anything to do with.
Yeah. And all I'm going to say about that is, like, cancel culture is an incredible thing, right? I think that when people purport to be quote unquote anti-woke and then wield woke tools, you have to be super, super cautious with that group of people.
Yeah, and I don't even care what terminology you want. It's just the same thing over and over again. It's powers and in groups and in clubs and excluding the people you don't like. And you can get through their little, buzzwords like mono ethnicity. We all know what that really means. We're not, we're adults. This kind of crap. And then you want to start deporting people. It's pretty clear what you want. And that's not the America that is successful, growing, and brings the most freedom to the most people possible, which is what I'm for. So
Yeah, and I think when you talk about quote unquote being an adult, I don't think adults necessarily have their beef out on Twitter. I think, when a person has 18 Twitter followers, I haven't read the tweets, to be completely honest with you, but I've heard a lot about them. And I don't think it's the right way to go about open conversation if that's what you really purport to be about.
yeah, Twitter, I said this because of the Musk stuff, but look, Twitter's still a sandbox. It's an important sandbox. There's a lot of important people in the sandbox. You can get some stuff done in the sandbox.
Yeah.
It's still a sandbox.
Yep.
And it's a very small, I think Twitter's internet penetration is like 8%, and that sounds like a lot, and it is, but Facebook's is like 44.
Yeah,
So,
and it's still an echo chamber.
Yeah.
Like it's still people picking and choosing what voices they want to, have bouncing off the walls of their proverbial echo chambers. And I think that there's not a better example of that than what has gone down with NYYRC over Twitter. I have 18 followers, or however many followers I have. I'm not a part of the conversation, and so it's a bunch of people talking to each other about issues that they agree on, and so it's been an interesting thing to watch unfold.
Yeah. Grace Bydalek. Let's talk about New York City for just a second, though, because you do live there. You do a lot of charity work there. It's not just your career path, and you've really tried to make a home there. Is the current situation in New York, is it getting a bad rap? You actually live there. You walk around there. You hang out there. You've got, your charity kids that you work with that I know that is so important to you. We do this with our friends in Portland. We've done that. I just did it when I went to Chicago. Everybody's got their stereotype in New York. Just give people what it's like for you actually living there. Just kind of turn the noise down a little bit, because we know, there's crime areas. Yeah, it's mismanaged and corrupt, but still, there are a lot of good people living there and good stuff going on. Just give folks a little bit of a pitch on New York City for folks like me that like to visit it but don't really want to hang out there too awful long.
Yeah, and that's fine, and it's a really good question, because I think that there's there are obviously the CNNs and the Fox Newses of the world that, are spreading these sort of scare stories about New York City. And there's a grain of truth in that. And that's why it is effective. Those stories are effective in scaring people away from the city. Obviously I'm from the Midwest, and my grandparents, every time we meet, at the Tex-Mex place down the street, are like, hey, so when are you moving home? Because the only thing that they've experienced about the city, or the only stories that they've heard from the city are stories of, from Fox News and from CNN, from the major media corporations. And that's, I think, unfortunate. But my cousins from Georgia actually just came to the city, and I was fortunate enough to be able to see them on Sunday morning, which was the day that actually I had the day before I had come home from DC, which is where I saw you. But they were like, oh, we totally get it now. Like we feel safer walking down the street in New York City at 11 p.m. than we do in Macon, Georgia, or than we do in our hometowns. And I can say that for sure about Omaha as well. I feel safer walking down the street in Midtown New York at 11:30 p.m. than I do in Omaha, Nebraska, because in Omaha, there's really no one. And in New York, there's always somebody there, right? Like there's always a group of people, bad and good, in New York who are surrounding you at essentially all times. And I think something that doesn't get enough credit in New York is really the incredible boom that we've seen post-COVID. Obviously, rents have been, skyrocketing the past few years because people have been, really, really wanting to be there and really wanting to pour themselves into the city. We see that not only on like a professional level, but also on a philanthropic level, right? Like, I just wrote a piece on the Bowery mission for Highline 9, which is a luxury gallery downtown. And, they saw right after COVID, they saw their numbers double, and the staff of Bowery Mission had to be super flexible and incredibly creative about the way that they were serving people. But in New York, that's just what people do. They stayed open. They opened their doors, and they made sure that these people had a place to go and had warm food and had a change of clothes and had a shower. And that's really what we're experiencing in New York right now, is people's sort of ingenuity as the city opens back up. So I have a lot of good things to say about the city. You do have to stand, in front of a pole in the system so that you're sure you're not going to be pushed into the draft. But that's a minor price to pay in the grand scheme of things, is what I think.
I was in Chicago, and our doorman, I was standing beside the doorman of the hotel I was at, and there was a group of people debating. They were businessmen that traveled, obviously. They were debating between New York and Chicago. And of course, they're standing in Chicago, so they're debating which is better, New York or Chicago. And it was funny. The doorman looked over at me and he goes, "I hear this all the time." And he goes, I was like, "Well, I was like, "Well, I'm not from here. Give me your take on it." He goes, "I'm all about Chicago. Way more corrupt, but still better ran." And I'm just like, this is the greatest line I've ever heard. So there's the Chicago doorman's who's been a doorman in Chicago for 40 years.
That's true. Although very exciting politically, Lee Zeldin, whether or not he won, he pulled up 4 down ballot Republicans, to victory in the midterms. And I think we've seen sort of a resurgence of conservatism in the city, unlike anything we've seen since maybe the 1980s, 1990s.
See, there's another thing that you need a local to explain, is like New York, kind of like LA, and it's heavy blue in the aggregate overall. There's some deeply conservative pockets. Yeah. There's parts of Staten Island, there's parts of Queens. It's kind of like LA, and you get out to Orange County and places like that. It's a lot more. It's not as monolithic, although on the map it is, and it'll probably always be eternally blue. But it's not like that on the local level either.
Yeah, no, it's not. You go to Staten Island and it's like a, bunch of blue collar firefighters, like, voting for Nicole Maliotakis over Max Rose every time. And, I think that we're sort of seeing, like I said, we're seeing a resurgence in conservatism, not only in those sort of, previously red pockets, but also in Manhattan proper. Regardless of whether or not Kathy Hochul thinks so, crime is a very real issue to New Yorkers. And I think that anybody with eyes who lives in New York City can see that, we've needed a change of leadership. And so that's why we saw sort of the success that we saw in the midterms, even if that wasn't an outright win.
You're gonna have to do something about that George Santos mess, though. That's not good. Grace Bydalek.
I love it, Andrew. You pronounce it.
I get the last one wrong. I just
you pronounce it differently every time.
God,
it's so good. It's so good.
Grace is joining us. No, we love Grace Bydalek so very much, and I practiced her name. I swear to God, I did. Grace, we love having you. Always enjoy the talk, my friend. Let folks know where they can keep up with you, since you avoid Twitter nowadays for good reason. But you got a lot going on. You got a lot of writing going on. Let folks know where they can keep up with you until we get you back again. It won't be as long next time, hopefully, because I'm going to practice between now and then.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I am on Instagram at Grace_Daily, DALEY. I also have a website where I post all of my writing, which is Grace Daily Bydalek, BYDALEK, at Gmail, or not at gmail.com, at .com. Yes, it's just .com. And in addition to that, you can read my theatrical reviews in the New York Sun. my freelance journalism in various outlets around the country, and my artist spotlights for Highline 9. And you can always reach me through the Dissident Project website as well, which is where I handle bookings and lead the project. So I am, open and available to talk.
Yeah. Okay, fair is fair. I butchered your name and I'm not going to edit it out. So you got to give me a time you flubbed a line or just could not get something right as a performer.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Great question. Brent Wagner, this is a story. Now you've launched me into a story. So Brent Wagner is one of the most revered musical theater educators. He started the Michigan program. He ran it for 30 years and he created like an empire at that program. And I was really, really blessed to study underneath him. I was one of the last classes that was chosen by him. And he had a Wagner like lecture, because he used to teach musical theater history classes. He had a lecture once a year that he gave, and he chose different people to perform beautiful songs from the musical theater repertoire that he thought were important enough to teach on. And he approached me my senior year and asked me to sing Not Getting Married Today, which is a Stephen Sondheim song, which is often called the most difficult song in musical theater repertoire. It is essentially like a patter song. It's a rap, basically, for people who don't know what a patter song is. But the first verse is like, "Pardon me, is anybody here because of everybody's here? I want to thank you all for coming to the wedding. I appreciate you going even more." Like just like 4 verses of unrelenting words. And I remember that I was through 3/4 of the song. We were coming up on the last verse, and I just like entirely blanked in front of probably 150, 200 people. Entirely blanked. And looked at Tyler, the accompanist, who was sort of vamping, and I was like, "Tyler, let's try that again." And we went from the last verse and we picked it up and we went through the end. But it is one of the greatest regrets in my entire life that I was not able to complete that song in the Wagner lecture setting, because I was so honored to be asked, and I flubbed it up. But what are you gonna do?
I'm just trying to think of, Unrelenting Words would be a great name for maybe your biopic one of these days. You might want to tag that one somewhere. Unrelenting Words. There we go. We got our Hallmark movie. Girl from the Midwest makes it in the city. Unrelenting Words. The Grace story. We love you to death. You're the best, Grace. Thank you so much for the time. Hope you have a great new year. We will definitely be seeing you, and hopefully we got a couple of the Dissidents we haven't had on yet. We need to get that worked out, get them back on, keep them in the rotation. We'll have them on, and you have a great 2023, and can't wait to see you there.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. This has been wonderful.
Thank you, ma'am. Back to Heard Tell. Okay, for something completely different, let's talk about whether or not grapefruits will kill you. No, seriously, over at The Atlantic, Catherine Wu writing, roughly a century ago, a new fad diet began to sweep the United States. Hollywood starlets, such as the Barrymores, supposedly swore by it. The citrus industry hopped on board. A figure conscious girl had to do was to eat a lot of grapefruit for a week or 2 or 3 or however long. It was called the grapefruit diet. Like pretty much all other fad diets, it's mostly bunk. All fad diets are bunk, by the way. Don't do them. You just end up in a yo-yoing doom loop that makes you feel worse after you're done, and it usually costs you a bunch of money you didn't have anyway. The citrus industry hopped all aboard on this, but what actually happened was the citrus was being recommended as part of a portion-controlled, low-calorie, low-carbohydrate diet, not because it had exceptional flab-busting powers, and yet the diet has survived through the decades, spawning revival in the 70s and the 80s, and a dangerous juice-exclusive spinoff called the Grapefruit Fast, and even got a shout-out from a Weird Al parody. And the hype still plagues nutritionists today, but for every grapefruit evangelist, There is a critic warning of its dangers, and usually somebody with a background in pharmacology. The fruit, for all its tastiness and dietetic appeal, has another more sinister trait. Turns out it raises the level of dozens of FDA-approved medications in the body, and for a select few drugs, the amplification can be potent enough to trigger a life-threatening overdose. For most people, chowing down on a grapefruit is completely safe. It would take a perfect storm of factors, say vulnerability of people that are taking an especially grapefruit-sensitive drug or medication within a certain window and drinking in excessive amounts of the particular grapefruit juice. For disaster to completely unfurl, says Emily Heal, an infectious disease pharmacist at the University of Maryland, but that leaves grapefruit in a bit of a weird position. No one can agree on exactly how much the world should worry about its bittersweet treat, whose chemical properties scientists still don't fully understand. Grapefruit's medication concentrating powers were discovered only because of a culinary accident. Some 3 decades ago, the clinical pharmacologist Dave Bailey, who just died earlier this year, was running a trial testing the effects of alcohol consumption on blood pressure medication called felodipine. Folks, there's going to be some pharmacology in here that I just can't pronounce, so let's just go through it together, shall we? As best we can. Hoping to mask the distinctive taste of booze to his volunteers, Bailey mixed it with grapefruit juice. Was shocked to discover the blood levels of of this drug, let's just give up on it, were suddenly skyrocketing in everyone, and even those in the control group who were drinking the virgin grapefruit juice. After running the experiments himself, Bailey confirmed that the juice was to blame. Some chemical in grapefruit was messing with the body's natural ability to break down the felodipine. I don't know. In the hours after it was taken, causing the drug to accumulate in the blood. It's the rough physiological equivalent of jamming a garbage disposal. Waste that normally gets flushed just builds and builds and builds. In this case, the garbage disposal is an enzyme called critochrome P450-3A4. Now, while that sounds like an address in Britain and or some kind of username of a bot, it has a shorter version, CYP3A4. I'm glad I'm not a chemist, folks. Capable of breaking down a whole slate of potentially harmful chemicals found in food and meds. And the jamming culprit is the compound found in the pulp and the peel of the grapefruit and other related citruses, including pomelos and Seville oranges. Doesn't take much. Even half a grapefruit can be enough to trigger a noticeable interaction, says George Dresser, a pharmacologist in Ontario. Possible consequences of the molecular clog can sometimes get intense. The full list of potential interactions is long. More than 50% of drugs on the market are metabolized by the CYP3A4. Sounds like a droid on Star Wars, doesn't it? Which inhabits both the liver and the gut, says Mary Payne, a pharmacologist at Washington State University. That said, grapefruit can greatly affect only intestinal CYP3A4 and will cause only a small fraction of those medications to reach notably higher concentrations in the blood. And only a small fraction of those medications will, when amassed, threaten true toxicity. Our bodies are always making more CYP3A4. Stop eating grapefruit, and within a day or two, the levels of protein should more or less reset themselves. But the professionals disagree on how to characterize grapefruit's risk. To Shirley Shinada, a pharmacist at UC San Diego, quote, "It's definitely a big deal," end quote, especially for organ transplant patients and others with other pre-existing conditions or those on heavy medication regimes that are susceptible. Her advice is for them to indulge in grapefruit exactly never. And ideally, the tacrolimus takers should skip related citrus too. Sonata even advises people to check the labels of mixed fruit juices just in case the maker sneaked in grapefruit. But Paul Watkins, a pharmacologist at UNC Chapel Hill, is much less worried. His bigger concern, he said, is the fruit reputation as a nemesis of oral medications has been way overblown. He said the study of grapefruit drug interactions, but abandoned it years ago after, quote, "I came to the conclusion it wasn't very important." But, he says, I think the actual incidence of patients who have gotten into any kind of trouble or had serious adverse reactions due to taking drugs with grapefruit juice is very, very small. Even the FDA seems unsure how to feel about the grapefruit. The agency has stamped the documentation of several grapefruit-sensitive medications with official warnings, but fact sheets for other drugs merely mention that they can interact with grapefruit. It says to consult a healthcare professional, or more importantly, just counsel people to avoid drinking the juice in large amounts, no matter what. Dan Nozowitz has reported for Atlas Obscura, a great publication, by the way. Make sure you're reading Atlas Obscura. I do frequently. Several interaction drugs have been bearing warnings in Canada, among them Viagra, oxycodone, and HIV antiviral Edurant, and a blood pressure medication Verapamil. Don't mention any issues with the grapefruit, though, when they appear in the United States. Very little solid data can precisely quantify grapefruit's peril. Over the years, researchers have documented a number of isolated cases of citrus drug interactions that prompted urgent medical care. But for now, conversation has mostly been stalled, while grapefruit has served up even more mysteries. In the years since Bailey's discovery, researchers have found that the fruit might lower the concentrations of certain drugs, such as allergy med, I'm not pronouncing this one, sorry. The concentration of certain drugs, such as an allergy med, perhaps by keeping the lining of the intestines from absorbing certain compounds. New drugs are particularly murky area, especially since grapefruit interactions aren't a typical first priority when a new medication hits the market. The popular COVID antiviral pill Paxlovid, for instance, contains the CYP3A4 susceptible ingredient ritonavir. Y'all just keep laughing at me. I'm still not going to pronounce any of this right, I'm afraid. A Pfizer representative told me the company is not concerned about toxicity, but he wonders whether grapefruit could mildly agitate some of Paxlovid's irksome side effects, like diarrhea, or maybe the sour metallic taste that reminds people of, well, grapefruit. Catherine Wu, writing in The Atlantic, ends it this way, saying, even people on certain medications may be able to enjoy it if they consult an expert first. Heel, who thinks the grapefruit is disgusting, even gave her dad the green light to enjoy a dinnertime cocktail and contained a small splash of juice. Maybe the smidge of fruit attracted his meds that day and affected them. But, quote, it isn't going to be the end of the world. Heel told me to say that, after all, would have been an exaggeration. It's in The Atlantic. We'll link to it. Don't worry about me, though. All my GI's issues, I'm already banned from all citrus. So I'm not going to be eating it, drinking it, or consuming it either which way. Just giving you something on a bit of a lighter note to consider here on Heard Tell, which will continue right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Let's end on a bit of a good note. Let's go local for me, back to my home area, the town right next to my hometown, if you can call it a town. But there's a piece in the West Virginia Press about the West Virginia Gold Star mothers dedicating a living memorial. It's an apple orchard, apple trees. Now, we got apple trees up yonder across the house that I grew up in. Fewer of them now. Storms keep kind of whittling them away. This is a really cool idea. But what's interesting about this piece was they had a contest about it, and an 8th grader wrote this. Maddie Mae Buckner for the West Virginia Press Association. We'll link to it. You can read her whole piece. The part that I got a little bit cracked up about, and you got to know the area a little bit, was this line right here, and I'm quoting here because this is the most Nicholas County thing, West Virginia, ever. The Living Memorial Apple Tree Orchard is located on Route 19 in Mount Nebo, directly across from the Tractor Bar. Yes, the Tractor Bar is a tractor bar because it was Mount Nebo Farm Equipment, selling actual tractors for the better part of 100 years until just now. A couple of years ago, they turned it into a full-blown bar and grill. It's actually been really successful. Don't laugh. They've got write-ups in GQ and major newspapers and a couple other things. So the Tractor Bar, they've changed from plowing fields to people getting plowed. What do you do? That'll do it for Heard Tell. Hope you're well wherever you and yours are listening. Make sure you're subscribing to all the podcasting platforms and the YouTube. And we can't wait to see you next time as we continue to turn down the noise of the news cycle, get to the information that matters, and discern the times we live in. So wherever you are, across the street or around the world, we hope you and yours are well. We hope you are well fed. And we'll see you again real soon for more Heard Tell. All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.